Hello, welcome. My name is Thomas Johnson, the Curator of Performance and Moving Image at Dunlop Art Gallery and RPL Film Theatre. I'd like to acknowledge that we're located on Treaty 4 territory, the traditional territory of the Cree, Saulteaux, Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis. It's our pleasure to invite you to nîpawistamâsowin, We Will Stand Up panel discussion with Brenda Dubois, Gina Star Blanket, and Dallas Hunt, and moderated by Sheelah McLean. I also want to thank Danielle Goulden, who unfortunately can't join us today, but Sheelah has graciously agreed to take on moderating of this discussion. Just a note, we won't be taking questions at the end, but instead providing the space for the panelists. The film by Tasha Hubbard is available through the NFB website and will be screened on October 31st at the RPL Theatre on Colton Boushey's birthday. The material in the film can be triggering and heavy, so an emphasis on the need for self-care and support is crucial. We encourage you to access the following resources, which will be on the screen, for support and/or to learn more. I'd also like to now thank Brenda and invite her to open this gathering and discussion. Brenda.
In order to prepare us for the evening, I'd like us to take a moment to just take your first cleansing breath as we prepare. And in that first cleansing breath, I want you to take a moment to reflect on 4 different things that you have gratitude for. I love doing this with kids because they have very simple gratitudes. They're thankful for even just waking up, but also they're thankful for the small things, for the fact that they have a house, they have food in their fridge. And I think that's where some of this stuff starts as well. So I want to ask the grandfathers, grandmothers to continue to look kindly on us. We're trying our best here on this place that we've been placed to be good human beings to one another. And every day we get challenged in that quadrants. All the 4 quadrants of our life are to be tended to by us. So I wish you the best in looking after your human. And as we get on for this evening, I want to reiterate what Thomas has said. If you have not seen the video, you might want to take some time over the next while to watch it. And you might want to watch it in chunks, not at all at once. But the discussion that's going to ensue is in relation to the Colton Boushey, Gerald Stanley, and other pending issues that are alive and well in our community still yet today. And I say our community, when I'm inferring that, I'm talking about an Indigenous community, even though I live in a broader context of Canadian society. So I want to thank you, Gina and Dallas, for being a part of this, adding your words again to another generation of youth and unawakened people. To hopefully start waking up and realizing that there's a different reality going on for another population group that needs to be tended with. And to ignore situations that potentially led to the Colton Boushey murder in our community, I think that is pressing. And for people to get down to the business of dealing with it instead of continuing to shove it under another intergenerational pile of bones as it goes on. And the other piece I always add is, if any youth are listening, I want you to remain hopeful. I apologize for the burden that's going to be placed upon you, but I am so proud of your energy, your education, and your vision to continue to have fortitude, to uncross people's eyes and clean out their ears in regards to another people that deserves life in coexistence. So, hi, that's what I'll do for this.
Now I'll invite Sheelah to bring forward on the discussion.
Well, I'd like to start by introducing myself. I'm a white settler born and raised in Treaty 6 territory, Cree territory, with Scottish, Swedish, Norwegian ancestry. I've been an anti-racist teacher for about 2 decades now, and had the honor of working in the Idle No More movement, really focused on justice, on Indigenous rights, Indigenous sovereignty, and addressing the racism and the genocide that Indigenous people face from a colonial system in what we now call Canada. And I'd like to introduce the people that are going to be on the panel tonight, answering the questions that Danielle has created for us and that we'll be talking about. Brenda Dubois is a mother and a cookum from Mascoupeton First Nations. She's worked extensively in the areas of child welfare, human justice, and environmental issues. And you can read more about her bio on the website. Gina Star Blanket is a Canadian Research Chair, Tier 2 in the Politics of Decolonization, and an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Calgary. Gina is Cree and Saulteaux and a member of the Star Blanket Cree Nation in Treaty 4 territory. Dallas Hunt is an assistant professor in the Department of English Language and Literatures at the University of British Columbia. He is Cree and a member of Swan River First Nations in Treaty 8 territory in Northern Alberta, Canada. And I just want to say how honored I am to be here, and thank you so much for joining us in this discussion. I know that, the director, Tasha Hubbard, is a close friend of mine, and I had the opportunity to hear her as she talked through and worked through the ideas for the film. Had an opportunity to see the first showing of the film here in Saskatoon and know the powerful impact that it's had on people across Canada and beyond. And so tonight we're going to be focused on some of the issues connected with the film, as Brenda said, and talking about some of the more, recent issues that have come up across Canada and how it's also connected to justice and connected to the film. One of the first questions I'm going to ask, and I'll start with Gina and Dallas, and then each panelist will have about 10 to 15 minutes to discuss the question, talk about the question a little bit, and then we'll move on to our next question. So we know that the film, nîpawistamâsowin has, We Will Stand Up, has won many awards, and that theaters have been filled with people who have watched the film. And I'm wondering, what have been the impacts on the film, do you think, on public consciousness regarding colonialism, regarding anti-Indigenous racism, and how is this connected to your work, the issues within the film?
Thank you, Sheelah. And I also just want to start by thanking Tomas for the invitation, to Brenda for opening us up in such a good way, for speaking those truths, and also speaking the beautiful words that you did about this current generation and looking forward. Those are sentiments that really resonated deeply with me. So thank you so much. And to Sheelah for moderating this discussion, and Danielle, even in her absence, for forming these questions. So this film, we too, had an opportunity to sort of be part of some of the conversations as it was in creation, or being created, being developed. And I think to me, some of the most important impacts of this film are the ways in which it really connects those systems and those structures that we live within to the day-to-day experiences that Colton and his family, and even Tasha's family, her experience as a mother raising a young Indigenous person in the prairies, it really did a great job of connecting the multiple scales at which colonialism impacts us, racism impacts us, and the violences that ensue from those structures. And so I think that to me, that's both connecting the kind of individual or interpersonal level and the larger systems that we live within, but then also connecting the history with present issues. I think those are some of the most impactful things that the film does, right? Of course, historicizing how we got here, and then prompting individuals who might be watching the film to rethink the stories that they hold true, or the stories that they see as true, and perhaps presenting them with a different narrative of what life is like in the prairies for Indigenous people.
Yeah, I would just echo Gina's sentiments and thoughts here, and I also just wanted to say thank you to Tomas and Brenda for giving such a fiery sort of opening. I really, at parts when we were writing the book, our storying violence book, we too had to sort of focus on Indigenous youth and really getting some of the sentiments that you were sort of articulating at the beginning across to them, right? And so to hear that from you at this moment was incredibly heartening. And so I'm not going to just repeat what Gina said, but I do thank you for the question, Sheelah.
And yeah, I guess how our work relates to the film is we were invited. We had written early on, actually during the Stanley trial. So when Gerald Stanley was on trial for the murder of Colton Boushie, Dallas and I worked together in Winnipeg, and we wrote an op-ed about the stories we were hearing circulate in the trial. So both the stories about Stanley as this sort of industrious, hardworking farmer who, was just doing the best he could in the sort of nightmare context that he had faced, and that's some of the language that was used by the court. But we were also hearing really terrible stories about Colton and Indigenous youth the other Indigenous youth that were with him in the car that day. So we wrote the op-ed to try and deconstruct some of those stories, and eventually were asked if we would write a book about that. So we did write a book called Storying Violence, Unraveling Colonial Narratives in the Stanley Trial, which doesn't reproduce what Tasha does in her beautiful film. But Tasha and Jade Tutusis, who's Colton's sister, did write the foreword to our book, and they really the book was meant to be a sort of supplement and kind of complement to the film. And I guess the project that we sought to undertake in that work was similar to what we did in the op-ed, which was just to really prompt people to reevaluate the stories that are told, again, about white rural settler life in the prairies, and then the stories about Indigenous people that we hear circulating so often. So that's largely how our work relates to it. I'm a political scientist, and Dallas is a literature scholar, so we tried to help out in this work the best that we could.
Well, and this is a copy of the book. And I know that Thomas said that they have a copy of the book at the library. Is that correct, Thomas?
That's correct, yes.
Yep. And you can also buy it at many stores right now. And it's a very powerful book. And I had an opportunity to read it before Jade and I started to work on the community guide and the learning guide. And it was very helpful in guiding, thinking about the narratives, the settler colonial narratives that created the violence. Brenda? Would you like to add anything about how this is connected to your work?
I think what you need to realize as well is we have to get rid of the word history in some contexts, because history is still here. It's just taken on a different attire and a different structure. And I do work not only in child welfare, but I do work in the court systems as well. It didn't really, it affected me because in the long run, it's another way of still putting out the truth so that people can feel it, process it, and decide what they want to do with it. And I think that's important to continue to get those truths out. The hard part in the long run, though, is a lot of people still don't believe it. It's like we got to do more and more. Like how many more bones you going to dig up before we prove it to you that this is actually going on? I'm going to wake up tomorrow to Groundhog Day again. Oh my God. I said I wasn't going to do this. But I have to get up with a hopeful sense of doing my business every day. I'm not apologizing for doing it. If I have to go advocate to get kids back, I got to go advocate for kids back. If I have to use certain language in that context, I have to do certain language in that context. Because in this day and age, there should be different ways to do business and transacting with other human beings. So yeah, this impacted me because one, I couldn't watch the whole video all at once. I had to watch it in chunks because I refuse to internalize it anymore and be numb. I have to feel it, I have to process it, and I have to figure out what am I going to do with it? How is it going to add to my bundle? And how is it going to add to my life in my community? And basically over the last while, don't mind me, my language goes. If I have to come into this court system, I have to say to the individual, if you're expecting justice here, you're not going to get it here. This is not our system. You're buying into a non-Indigenous system. And you're going to have to settle for their justice. If you want reparation, reparation and restitution, you're going to have to work on that yourself because they don't care about that stuff. We have a different way of looking at things in life, and people are having a hard time seeing through our lens because it means you have to feel it. And a lot of people are used to just numbing themselves and distancing themselves from it, and it doesn't affect them. Well, this affects you. Everything that goes on in the justice system regarding another population group affects you, whether you like it or not. You can put your head in the sand, but I always say, if you put your head in the sand, what's up in the air? Yeah.
Yeah, I think too, one thing we do in the book is we, drawing off of Christina Sharp's work a little bit, is we talk about the past that is not yet past, right? So we generally think about these things in the past, but they're not. They're very much in the present and operative and functioning, right? And functioning in the way that they're actually in many ways supposed to, which is the regulation of especially Indigenous populations, right? In these very punitive ways, whether that's through the a sort of carceral sort of logic that sort of operates, right, as you were speaking to there, Brenda. But yeah, I think one thing we do try to get at least in the preface of the book, is that one way or another, this quote unquote history, which isn't a history, it's a past that's not yet past, right? Is actually a shared history and an inherited history, right? So you can do what you want about that. You can put your head in the sand, as you were saying, but nothing absolves you from that history and the ongoing obligations and responsibilities that you have to the people in these territories, the ancestral territories of Colton Boushie, his relatives, and all of the other Indigenous communities in this area. And so this is something that we really wanted to sort of foreground in the book and in relation to Tasha's film, is that nobody gets off here, right? Like you don't just get to, I mean, I know many people will try to, but we really wanted to emphasize this sort of notion of being, especially non-Indigenous and settler peoples, being aware of their stories too, right? The sort of narration of violence, really. And yeah.
I think everybody's going to come to terms with truth telling, not just history, truth telling. Yeah. How did you get here? Which advertisement did you see? Land for free? And when you came, how did that happen? Because everybody that's here are intergenerational descendants of that beginning. Harsh reality. Yeah. And other harsh reality is some of them are my relatives already now too. People of color, they're all my relatives too. And that's a reality in moving forward. We have Indigenous people in all spectrums now. So the more the film gets out, the better. But in some cases, like I really encourage people to do what you're doing right now. If you're putting out this stuff and there's no place for people to go and debrief, go and talk to people, they're going to leave there still with a mindset, and we don't know what that mindset is. See? Yeah. So I do.
Thank you. I know that after the trial, Gerald Stanley's trial, there were many school systems that received emails from their school boards telling teachers that they couldn't talk about or teach about the trial and the outcome. And the Saskatoon public school system here in Saskatoon was one of those school systems where I saw the emails. And I know that research shows that topics like colonialism, the genocide of Indigenous people, anti-Indigenous racism have been mostly absent from public education systems in Canada. So in your opinion, we know that schools are starting to show the film. School systems are starting to use the film. What is the best way to incorporate topics of colonialism and anti-Indigenous racism into education systems in Canada? How important is that? How can the film be used, and what are some ways that people can do that? Gina, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely for me, you can't start too young. I have a kid, a 6-year-old's in grade 1, and she's been learning about residential schools. And it's, I think we approach these things, these topics tenderly, especially with very young children. But I'm constantly amazed and inspired at how much of a sense of justice she has, at how much she's able to comprehend the many layers that she's learning about when she learns about residential schools. And unfortunately, I live in Alberta, I live in Calgary, and there's recently been a number of proposals to actually remove some of that from the curriculum, to remove lessons about residential schools and other related discussions of colonialism, particularly from the sort of early years. And I just think it's so important that we continue to start with them young and to keep speaking not just about, these sort of kind of, not just indigenizing the curriculum and integrating, knowledge of Indigenous people's histories and Indigenous traditions and Indigenous contributions to Canada. I think that's important, but like Brenda was saying, we really need to have those very difficult conversations, right? Those very uncomfortable conversations about colonialism and the violence that's associated with it and the violence that ensues. And this is so difficult with especially young children, because they just don't understand why people would be mean to other people, why anyone would do that to children, why anyone would support something that results in so much violence, right? And so it's always kind of a tricky topic and a tricky area to teach, particularly the young ones. But I really think, we need to have those conversations as early as possible and then build on them. Again, in university, by the time students get to my class, Indigenous politics is what I teach. A lot of them will say, all I ever learned about Indigenous people was that you used all of the buffalo. And that's what I came into this class knowing, really, right? And I think a big part, there's been that sort of, Harold Cardinal talked about it as the buckskin curtain, and that was, God, what was that? 50 years ago now. And it's very much still intact, right? That sort of ignorance towards those we share our lives with in communities, particularly in urban centers, but also in rural spaces, right? So that sort of lack of awareness and desire to know about one another's lives and experiences, and how different communities and different people might be contributing to those divides and to upholding that violence, particularly when they're the beneficiaries of it. So certainly there's a reluctance to learn about these topics and to think through them and to think through topics like settler privilege. But yeah, for me, it's about getting those conversations started early, and not just in the school system, but at home too, because the kids are going home and that's where they're learning a lot of this, right?
Yeah, I think too, just to add a slight note, it is a weird sort of kind of I guess it's not really a contradiction, but it's a sort of tension, I guess you could say, in that as Alberta actively tries to suppress the histories of residential schools and things like that, which is really, so as somebody who is about Native studies and Indigenous studies issues broadly, I find that one of the only things that people actually know about Indigenous peoples is actually residential schools, right? So I try to navigate this sort of complex sort of interplay of being like, there is so much more you need to learn about when it comes to Indigenous peoples, nations, communities, treaties, forms of governance, histories, the ongoing colonial violence, things like this. And I do think there's a way in which Indigenous peoples do become sort of entrapped in these sort of narratives of victimry, which what I'll say about that is that during the residential school process, Indigenous peoples were resisting all the time. They were burning schools down. They were fighting nuns and priests. Children were doing this, right? And families were hiding their loved ones, right? So part of me wrestles with this idea of allowing this sort of, what at times seems like a meta-narrative or sort of over-determined or predetermined narrative about Indigenous peoples, especially in relation to residential schools. Sometimes I'd like to challenge students in my class about this and sort of ask them to accord a sort of complex personhood to Indigenous peoples, right, and their kin. At the same time, you have, as Gina was saying, like the Alberta government actively trying to even take that away, right? So it is a monumental task, and I'm sure Brenda has a lot to say about this, but I do appreciate the question, Sheelah.
Brenda?
Until we actually control our own educational institutions, we will have to rely on how they frame the context of what they allow in schools. Deny, but holding secrets away from a new population is going to be shocking when they come to terms with the realities of the truth. Like, how can you destroy all the reports? The Royal Commission report, even the Truth and Reconciliation, the Murder Missing, debate reports. How can you destroy that material and keep it away from students? Because if we're into teaching and sharing knowledge, but only from one vantage point, that's a lie. That's a lie. Because you have not told the other vantage point. There's two sides to every story. But I guess the harsh reality here is, because I've taken a little bit of schooling too, I realized that history can be rewritten. How we have to put this in context is until we actually get control of our own institutions and are able to actually frame the context in reality, it's going to be really tough because our truth telling is going to come out a little bit different. Our truth telling is going to come out different. Our values are going to come out different. Our worldview is going to come out different. And there's a piece. No matter what, they're still trying to control a population of people. And, you triggered me a little bit, Dallas, because you said something about they try and build a misconception that we didn't resist. That sort of came out too, partly in one of the Kairos exercises that I partook in, where one of the facilitators actually stood up and went to one of the participants and told them, do not resist. We do not resist. And that triggered me so bad because I swore and I told them, you are in the province of resistors, lady. You don't forget that. And that's a reality. So some people have the ability to reframe truth in a way that makes people feel better, but isn't truth telling.
Thank you, Brenda.
Absolutely. I want to hear applause. Just kidding. I know we're being very, very serious about topic, but a lot of our stuff too, no matter what we do, we always try to figure out how we're going to laugh because it doesn't fit right? So we are talking about a really tough issue because if we don't laugh or something, the air gets stank. It's not our air. So
it is heavy, and that's kind of what we're going to be talking about next is those deep learning moments and how the impacts of these kinds of discussions are different for Indigenous people than they are for non-Indigenous people. And how, for white settlers in particular, when we talk about settler colonialism as a genocide, or when we talk about the violence that comes from settler colonialism, that there's a lot of discomfort, and that there's recognition of the inequities that are happening in our communities today. As you said, this is partly in our history, but also lives today and continues today. And so one of the things that we wanted to talk about tonight is the fact that Colton Bushy's mother, Debbie Baptiste, and Colton's family hope that communities would engage in anti-racist education and action. They hope that other families don't have to face this same heartbreak. And in a province like Saskatchewan that's deeply rooted in genocide and systemic racism, what do you think is the personal responsibility of settlers, of non-Indigenous people? And the second part of the question is, how can governments and organizations take some kind of a leading role in addressing this systemic racism in our province? And Gina, maybe I'll turn back to you to start.
Well, I grew up in Saskatchewan, and so I know very well how white Saskatchewan and, white rural Saskatchewan in particular has a lot of myths about the goodness of its people, the sort of virtuousness of its people, and the righteousness of its social and political formations. And so I think, something I'm very interested in is sort of deconstructing those myths. Again, thinking through where we're all situated relative to these structures that govern us. Again, as someone who studies politics, that's certainly something that I'm very passionate about, both personally and politically. And so I think that, I'm not going to sit here and kind of repurpose or paraphrase all of the literature on allyship. It does get a lot of space. There's a lot out there. And so, inform yourself, learn about your responsibilities and the best way that you can contribute to either, at an interpersonal level, confronting some of those ideas and stories and myths that circulate, or at a broader level. I know something that Jane and Tasha always talk about is how to contribute. That colonialism is such a enormous perennial issue that it needs to be, attacked and dismantled from many different angles. And we all have different gifts that we can contribute to that project. And so they always talk about, if you're an artist, create something. If you're a writer, write something. There's all these different ways that people can contribute to social justice advocacy, but also to interrogating and working to bring forward more decolonial ideas and commitments. So, that's what I would say. Learn about your own histories, learn about, from the ample resources that there are out there on allyship and how to be a good ally. And then also how you can contribute when Indigenous people have, suffered violences, when Indigenous people are threatened with dispossession of their land, ongoing dispossession is happening every day all around us, right? And so there's many different sites through which people can contribute and help mobilize.
Yeah. So I think I would just reiterate what I was saying earlier about the sort of implicatedness of non-Indigenous peoples in the histories of Indigenous peoples, right? The shared history and inherited history. I personally do not actually invest much hope or I think it's going to come outside of the government and outside of particular organizations that already sort of monopolize particular fields of, whether that's media attention or just even a public discourse. I do think there are ways in which, in our book, we have a subtitle that is "The System Isn't Broke; It Was Built That Way." And in many ways, it's precisely because of particular formations of governments and particular organizations that have actually sort of enabled this whole particular institutions to actually not in any meaningful way sort of change their modes of operation, right? So I guess what I would say in terms of the personal responsibility of non-Indigenous peoples is be aware of your histories, be aware of your stories, what Brenda was talking about in terms of like, how did your ancestors get here? What do those histories look like? Because they actually probably look incredibly violent. And that's something that people don't actually like to think about, especially about their ancestors, right? But you're still in relation to those ancestors. And so you have an obligation to sort of unpack or disentangle those sort of violent histories that have been done to other groups of people. So I think those are two different sort of responsibilities. I think in the everyday, it might be easier to enact, but I think it's a perennial and difficult question.
And I mean, one of the things, I guess, moving from awareness to action is probably one of the most important shifts. So there's been a lot of sort of surveys and research done on public opinion about Indigenous people and how it's changed since people have started to learn more about, let's say, residential schools. And some of this research has found that particularly in the prairies, while more people might have an awareness and understanding that residential schools happened, they're much less willing to connect what the violence is that have occurred against Indigenous people, dispossession of land, and all of those sorts of things. They're still unwilling to connect those to their understanding of present day issues, right? They still don't see those as very related to the forms of suffering, the forms of marginalization that Indigenous people continue to experience. So again, it's that shift from learning and being aware and recognizing histories of colonialism and ongoing colonialism, and connecting that to the way in which you understand Indigenous people, to the way in which you interact with Indigenous people, right? And to, the way in which your social and political commitments play out in action.
Thank you. That's true. But I think when you look at it and you look at it as that spectrum, it's a spectrum, but it starts with, does that individual even have a vested interest in having a relationship with Indigenous people, or are they just a settled racist? Because I've come to terms with the reality that there are some people who are settled racists and may not want to change their attitudes and are quite set in their privilege and understanding why they should maintain those attitudes. So those individuals I sort of set aside because those are a little bit more resistant to any type of change. Anybody else, I sort of look at what do they want to do? Where do they got to start? And the hard part is too, it's not my job to do all that education. And that's the hard part in some of this stuff is sometimes people come a little bit too eager and they haven't even done a lot of education and they haven't had someone to talk to. So yes, it's just sort of rattling in their head. And I agree with what Gina said. You have to figure out what you want. Where are you going to start? Are you even curious about what's going on? You heard some stuff about residential school, or what's this about going on with the Indians here? You want to check it out. Well, you go start checking it out. Start reading books, start going to movies, videos, great videos out there, learning videos. Start mixing and mingling with Indigenous people. I like some of my friends in the city. She does a coffee, golden, silver, whatever, golden thing evening where she invites a whole bunch of people for a meal, but it's all peoples, all different peoples, and we have really deep conversations. So I guess the other piece too is when you're looking at government structures can educate their staff, but if their staff have to go back and do what that system is telling them to do, which is a genocidal act, it's sort of contrary. We can educate all these people about Kairos, residential school, all the stuff. And we make the connection between the fact that there are more kids in care than there were during residential school, but we'll educate the social workers about us, but yet they have to go work with an institution that makes them, that frames that context of legalized genocide and kidnapping of our children. I really look forward, the piece over the last while, what I've had to realize in regards to the necessity of having good allies. I'm so thankful for some of the good allies that we have, because in the long run, sometimes those are the first places and first doors that we refer non-Indigenous people to go to, because it's easier. I don't have that time. And it's like giving a gentleman permission to ask 4 questions. Well, he didn't give thought to his questions. All he needed to do is ask 1 question, but he wasted all his questions in 1 ask. So it's not for wanting a trying as well, but I guess I go back to that piece that how can we educate people when the systems are framed in a context? Because even now in educating some of these ones, then they know what social service is doing. They know what justice is doing. They're saying like, they still got to do what the system tells them to do. And that's a reality. And even with the justice system over the last number of years, you see sentencing circles slowly start coming in. I haven't heard about a sentencing circle going on for years.
Yeah, that's right.
So not for wanting of change, but to incorporate change means working through the friction, modeling change methodologies, but also mentoring change. Because if you're not mentoring change, people try go back by the 6th month because the honeymoon period is over and they're tired of having to do this different way of working with people, because it's actually investing in people, not looking at people as a commodity. I better keep quiet now.
Thank you, Brenda. I think one of the things that has come out of that question is this idea of like institutions and structural change, and that most of government institutions, organizations, as Dallas and Brenda both talked about, the policies and practices are colonial policies and practices. So even when you educate people that are working in those institutions, they still have to follow colonial policies and practices. Brenda, did you want to add something?
Yes. I would love to add the fact that everybody got really excited about the calls to action and got on the train. They don't realize that there were some principles before those calls to action. And one of the principles is actually the tearing down of colonial and archaic structures. So like they sort of voided a whole section of the calls to action that actually guided that track. So even though they're on the calls to action, they forgot. They're supposed to be tearing down those colonial and archaic structures. And I don't even want to get into too much because we just settled our elections yesterday.
Yeah.
So we have to figure out what's our next.
Well, and I know that
How do we get ready? How do we get ready for this next round? No matter what government's in place, how do we get ready for this next round? When our leadership is utilizing those structures to excuse themselves from not doing the work that needed to be done years ago. You know, I need to, that's enough. I need to stop. I'll put my small foot in my big mouth here. But it's not that I don't care. It's I care too much. And we have to get ready for another wave because they're still doing this work here on a daily basis in our community. And they don't even have the willingness to sit with the matriarchs of this community to develop and work together to develop something new. Because they're scared to share power and authority. Because if the leadership in power wanted to change it, they would change, especially the child welfare one, overnight by just saying one statement. We are not here to take your kids. We're going to wait till the Cookums come, and they'll all help us decide what's going to happen with your participation as well.
Yeah.
The taking away of that choice for individual people is an inhumane act. I don't know if I should. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm not angry. I'm not angry. Don't misinterpret what I'm saying as anger. I'm extremely hurt. Yeah.
So that last question, Brenda, and given that this continues and that Indigenous laws, Indigenous governance systems are completely ignored by this government, what are some of the ways to organize and challenge these systems that harm Indigenous communities? What can we learn from movements like I Don't Know More, the Land Back movement, Black Lives Matter movement about social change and what those possibilities are? Gina, do you want to start?
Sure. I think one of the interesting things that many communities are trying to do, and many organizations and networks, advocacy movements are trying to do, is work towards change in ways that are more grounded in their own understanding of their laws and ways of relating with other human beings. And so, there was obviously this period in time where Indigenous peoples were very much seeking change through state institutions, this leading up to and in the decades following the patriation of the Constitution, really fighting hard for recognition of our rights through the courts and through political avenues. But we saw the damage that did to our relations, right? We saw the way in which Indigenous women were being treated by some of these mainstream organizations and their representatives. We saw the ways in which, going through the courts pit many Indigenous people against each other in trying to seek, let's say, a title claim or recognition of a right, or even reparation for a right that had been infringed. And I think over time, we've become more aware of the sorts of harm that can happen to our ways of relating and living well together when we have to use those avenues for change, right? And so more and more people, I think, are grounding their forms of political action and mobilization in our fundamental interconnectedness and relatedness, and that includes our relatedness with the living earth, right? So we're mindful of how we might have lost sight of those modes of relating because of the damage that's been done to our relationships with creation, right? That was a direct part of colonialism, right? Targeting those ways of relating and ways of being in relation with the living earth and with one another. And so, people are reclaiming that and are working to repair those forms of relating so that we're not enacting those forms of violence against one another as Indigenous people, but also between Indigenous people and settler communities. So again, Leanne Simpson has, she's an Anishinaabe scholar and activist, and she talks a lot about how our work sort of starts with ourselves and then radiates outward in these sort of concentric circles, right? So starts with ourselves, then how we engage with the people we share our lives with, and then within our own community, and then between communities, and then between Indigenous people and settlers, right? And it doesn't have to follow that sort of linear trajectory, but I think what she's really getting at there is the power, in those modes of relating, and really how crucial those are. How are we going to advocate for decolonization and work towards decolonization if we're still treating one another in really violent ways?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just to sort of pick up on, I guess, some of the sort of movements you were gesturing to, Sheelah, or naming explicitly. I mean, just in terms of organizing and challenging. So, just on a personal level, when I was doing my PhD, it was I started basically at the height of the I Don't Know More movement, and while I was taking Native Studies classes and invested in my own research at that time, there was something in the air at that particular moment that allowed me to, not only as like a researcher and a grad student, but also as a TA, to sort of relay these sorts of exciting sort of events and things to my students. So there's a weird sort of long lineage there with me, starting from Idle No More, that goes to just recently. I was teaching a course on anti and decolonial theory, and all of the stuff with the Wet'suwet'en and the Unistoten camp sort of going on, and so that was a time for me as a professor to say, we're not coming to class today. Y'all want to go shut down Cambie and Broadway in Vancouver? Go shut down Cambie and Broadway in Vancouver. And these are young people doing this, right? And it's incredibly heartening. And I'm seeing a lot of sort of what Gina was sort of gesturing towards, which is these sort of constellations of co-resistance, right? Which is I'm starting to see a lot of non-Indigenous, basically Black, people of color, people residing in what is currently called Canada, actually taking up these sort of Indigenous issues and really sort of organizing alongside Indigenous youth. And I do the foreground again, just to go back to what we said at the beginning. It is really Indigenous youth that are leading a lot of these sorts of movements, right? And we need to, I think, as older Indigenous people, really support that work, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And I think too, just
trust them.
Trust them.
Like trust that they know what they're doing too, right?
100%.
Yeah.
And I think too, just to finish, I think the land back movement is just there's all these incredible movements online. I think there can be more conversations, in my opinion, between Black Lives Matter and some Indigenous groups. And I think there's a lot of like sharing of resources and tactics and strategies that we can actually sort of co-organize around, and maybe just better, sort of facilitate those sorts of But I think there's a lot of work to do, and I think we can do it together. So
Thank you.
I'm just going to add to that. If anybody wants to do anything, pick your battles wisely, because there's too many to fight. And stay concentrated on that one, to the point of figuring out, do you need to push to actually get legislation changed in order to affect policy change, in order to be able to then mobilize the new population of staff to do business in a different way. I think at the core of anything that's going forward, not only, I ask myself this question, and I want other people to ask themselves this question: how is your helping harming? If we're going to do stuff from now on, how is our helping going to harm? And are we going to create problems for another generation? Or are we going to clear a path for another generation to at least get through less strenuous than and painful than what we had to go through? And the other piece too is you got to get into language, terminology, the words, and how we relate to one another with those words. I remember when we were doing the first organizing here, just around families, children in care, that was the first word we had to sort out. When we said family, we were meaning the whole entire extended family, matriarch, patriarch. When they said family, they were talking about the mom. Very rarely were they even inferring that there was a papa. So it's really clarifying terminology and realizing that if you want to have some of these conversations, it might get a little bit tough. But it's up to people to come back and continue that learning. We're not trying to chase you away. This is hurtful knowledge. And that is a part of another piece. I remember stepping out on a Kairos exercise Some other people had left to go to the bathroom, and there was a lady standing in the hallway crying. Out of 40 people, she was the only one standing in the hallway crying, and she was apologizing for her crying. And I says, no, you are confirming that you are a human being because now you are feeling it, you are processing it, and you will see it now when you go out in the community. You'll even smell it. I said, but what worries me is the 39 other people in that room that aren't crying. And it is. You wonder, how could that happen to populations of people? And we're still yet in 2020 trying to convince them that residential school existed. Like at some point in time, Groundhog Day's got to stop. I guess that's my wish for another generation, is not to burden you, but that you don't wake up to Groundhog Day and you wake up to that utopia that we have 72 different governance offices in the province of Saskatchewan. And we have ministers of family services, family wellness, and we have our ceremonies alive. And you know, it's beautiful. Buffalo's back. Buffalo's back. Yeah. So, you know, that's the other piece. It's given us that other livelihood. What other things and economic enterprises can we get into? Because there has been a population of young ones that have graduated, are out there, and we now need to get into business, economic enterprises, influence the world. And we then will be able to hire maybe some of our own people, because some of our people cannot get hired in some of these structures, in some of these spaces. And some people are. Some people are opening doors, are welcoming, embracing, love people, love other human beings. And they model that in their workplaces, in their floras, because they cultivate that. But others don't. And the ones that don't, may be a little bit afraid to step out. And all I encourage people to do is be clear about your intention of what you're wanting to do. Don't come out here saying you want to help, but meanwhile, you want to come out here and tell people what to do or criticize them for the way they're living. Learn how to love people and embrace people. I'm not saying you don't have boundaries and rules, we all do, but get to know another human being. Never know. Might become my sister, might become my brother. Hi.
Thank you, Brenda and Gina and Dallas. What a perfect note to end on. I think that we've come to the close of this webinar, and I want to open this space for a closing prayer and closing comments from each of you.
Basically, I don't really do closing prayer because this event doesn't really end till Saturday night. So I don't do closing prayer. I do this, and I close off with closing prayer after Saturday night because this is a whole long exercise. But usually what I ask people is to sort of share, like, what is one thing that stood out from this evening? And even the participants that may be listening, what is one thing that stood out from this evening for you? Peak it. Start organizing your own coffee circles. It's about realizing that when you want to do something, you are part of a ripple. And you can't change the world in another country, but you can affect the ripple that you are around. And that's the hard piece. That's a piece for youth, especially, to understand, because youth want to change the world, but they can affect the world that they're in. And that's where they start. They start at their coffee tables with their mums and their papas. They start with their friends in the schools. And let me tell you, like I said, they pick their battles. Wisely, and start reframing this context. And don't be afraid of the voice, the things that need to be expressed. We can't take them back once they're in the air. And sometimes it's good to say, I just want to put this in the air. Maybe we'll talk about it. And creating those spaces that people can talk about this and about concerted change with one another. Starts with us. I do. I'm done. Gina. And Dallas.
Thanks.
Yeah, so for my closing comments, I actually really appreciated what Brenda said about your helping can harm people. After my last comments and after you shared that, Brenda, one thing that I was thinking about was, and maybe I'll leave with these, is just politics doesn't just happen in these sort of formal institutions, right? Everything we say and do is political. And so when we're mobilizing towards change, it's not enough, just as an example, to say, oh, we're grounding our movement in treaty. How are you invoking treaty? Are you conceptualizing treaty extremely narrowly as this sort of, the expansion of the sort of written down terms that were recorded by the Crown? Or are you grounding that work in a really robust understanding of treaty, the type that our ancestors used to fight for and put their bodies on the line for, right? This is something that, over the years, we've seen treaty taken up or advocated for in these educational campaigns as reconciliation, these sorts of things. And that's very important, but that's not where we end, right? Treaty, there's still so many outstanding questions, jurisdictional questions, the NRTA, all these sorts of things that, have never been resolved under treaty. They're not land cessions. So we need to be aware of the politics of how we're invoking these concepts and how we're deploying these concepts politically, and how we're grounding our advocacy work in these different concepts. And treaty is just one example, right? There's a million other examples that you can give, but just to be mindful of the political implications of the words you say and the actions that you're undertaking and the movements that you're part of.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to actually just go back around to something that Brenda had said about using this term friction, right? I want to sort of emphasize or sort of end with this notion of living with or staying with the friction, right? And so partly what I mean by that is that there are people, as Brenda and we've talked about already, people who avoid the friction entirely, right? They don't want to be with the discomfort and they don't want to dwell in those sort of affective, emotional states, right? But that's what it means to be in relation with another person. You need to actually sit in this discomfort because these histories are uncomfortable. And so I think it's good to sort of stay with the friction. And then on the other side of things, I think there is a sort of drive, especially by liberal democratic sort of institutions or leaders or what have you, who also want to foreclose on this notion of staying with or living with the friction, right? It's reconciliation or bust. Reconciliation has to happen now. And that's not how people relate to one another. And that's not how Indigenous peoples related to one another, right? So this is an ongoing thing. I know the current government has a tendency to focus on this notion of process, which also can actually be quite harmful depending on how it's deployed or mobilized. But I also want to sort of just say, just dealing with students and others that it's disquieting, it's discomfort, and it's uncomfortable. But again, these are our obligations, and we need to sort of inhabit them, as it were.
Yes, and I want us to not settle for the dance. I want us to change the dance. When I go into a session and this person says to me, "Oh, Kokom, I'm interested in consulting you," I stop them and I tell them I'm not into consultation. I'm into Omamawi Atuskewin, which is working together. They want to consult with somebody, hire a consultant. I'm not into consulting. That's patronization. And that's patronization at its finest. And the other one too is, as the change is going on within their structures, do not trust them impeccably to have our best interest in mind. They may put a smudge policy together in the Department of Justice, but it never gets enacted in any structure that they have. And the smudge policy sits in their smoking policy. So please, whatever these structures are doing, look at it and question it under a microscope. Do not trust them until you actually see those documents in your hand or walk through those spaces and say, where can I smudge? And they don't tell you where you can smudge. Well, you're going to know in 3 months where you're going to smudge and how that's all going to happen, because the world is going to change whether they like it or not, because we are here. Yeah. Hi. Kitwam.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, Brenda, for that ending. And also, I think the comments that this isn't closed, the conversations are still ongoing, and we do encourage you to take this and to move forward with your own conversations. We do have the book by Dallas and Gina, Storying Violence, as well as the education guides that Sheelah's helped develop for the film. And the film itself, which we'll be screening on October 31st. Brenda will be on hand as well, and we will have smudging available at the theater for that. Again, I just also remind you, if you do need any support from this conversation, please see the resources that we have here. But just, yeah, thank you so much, everyone here, Gina, Dallas, Brenda, and Sheelah, for your generosity, your insight, and your truth-telling.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks.
Hey. Jimmy Gwich.